we'll call this meeting to order. Roll call.
Director Atwell,
Yes.
Director Bradford is absent. Director Brown.
Yes.
Director Ledbetter is absent. Director Vasquez.
Here.
Next up, we have public communications.
Any person may speak about any subject of concern within the jurisdiction of TRLIA, which is not on today's agenda. The total amount of time allotted shall be limited to a total of 15 minutes, and each individual or group will be limited to no more than 5 minutes. If you are participating via Zoom and wish to comment, please use the raise hand function or *9 if participating on a phone.
There's no public communication. Next up, we'll start the consent item, approved meeting minutes of April 5th, 2022.
Move to approve.
Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Motion carries unanimously. B, adopt resolution authorizing remote teleconference meetings of the Three Rivers Levy Improvement Authority pursuant to the Brown Act.
You gotta open the public hearing.
Sorry.
Open the public hearing. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Okay. Okay, we'll do that. So we're gonna move to C.
Well, isn't C consent? I thought we did.
Yes.
So we, okay. Oh, got it. All right. Yes. Okay, perfect. Adopt resolutions approving and certifying the environmental impact report for the 500-year flood protection project as pursuant to California Environmental Quality Act, approving and adopting findings of fact and statement of overriding considerations, mitigation monitoring and reporting program, and direct staff to file a notice of determination. Do we have Kevin?
And just so we're clear, this is a public hearing, and so Chair, if you could open the public hearing.
Okay.
I don't know. Need to open it.
We'd like to open the public hearing at this time.
Good afternoon, Chair Atwell, members of the board. Rick Reinhardt with MBK Engineers. I'm going to give a presentation on the 500-year project. This presentation has two pieces. There is an action item associated with it. We're asking the board to consider taking action to adopt a resolution certifying the EIR for the 500-year project, as well as adopt a resolution adopting the findings and statement of overriding considerations. And so that will be at the tail end of the presentation. We'll have that back up for your consideration. This is actually a big milestone for Three Rivers. We've been focused on achieving FEMA 100-year certification and state of California 200-year certification, and we're close to doing both. We plan on bringing the 200-year to your board for action in June, and then FEMA will follow that later in the summer. Along the way, we've learned that it really isn't going to take that much more of an investment to get the 500-year, especially with the water agency considering the ARC spillway at New Bullards Bar. And so I'm going to start off with the informational piece about what we think it's going to take to get to 500-year. So let me run through the presentation first. The purpose, we're going to provide background, purpose and objectives, update a status on the project design and cost, describe the recommended alternative, and summarize the draft EIR comments, final EIR, and key CEQA findings. So as we presented to your board in, I believe it was February, the existing RD 794 levy system, the way it was constructed over time has led to varying levels of protection. On the Yuba River South levee, for example, up near the Goldfields, we have close to 200-year, but as you move farther downstream towards the Feather, the level of protection increases to 300 a year. The Feather River levee is about 370 a year. And the Bear River at the downstream end in the setback area is about 370. And as you move upstream, it's 200 a year. And then all the Western Pacific Interceptor Canal and the Olivehurst Detention Basin Ring Levee is 200 a year. Now, with just the action of the water agency building the Arc Spillway is going to increase these even higher, but not quite to 500 a year. So the purpose of the project is to ensure that the RD-74 urban levee system is resilient to climate change by improving the weak links in the system. The portions of the system that, as you saw, that are at 200 year, want to get up to the same level as the rest, so that there's not one portion of the 784 system that we know is going to either overtop first or fail from undersea additions first. The objectives are to improve all the segments, to have a uniform level of protection, ensure that the 200-year urban level of protection is maintained over time in the face of increasing flows from climate change. We want to complete improvements in accordance with state and federal flood risk reduction funding requirements to make sure that we can leverage state and federal funds to implement the project. And then we put in there an objective of complete the improvements by December 31st of 2027, because in the CEQA document, we need to communicate something to the public about when this project might be completed. But its actual completion is going to be a function of what happens with the Arc Spillway and the availability of state and federal funds. So in going through this process, the biggest variable is how the Department of Water Resources is going to operate Oroville with the flood-informed reservoir operations once the Arc Spillway is completed. That in the comprehensive needs assessment, they propose just operating FERO for a water supply benefit and not flood control. And so while the water agency is looking at operating for both, the DWR, at least initially, hasn't proposed doing that. That leads to a much higher water surface than if DWR operated for both flood control and water supply. For design purposes, we've assumed that the outcome of that FERO process will be that Oroville and Bullards Bar are operated for flood control and for water supply. In our EIR, we made the more conservative assumption that they're only operating Oroville for water supply. So that way we have coverage in the event that several years from now, when that FERO operation is completed, we have the flexibility to implement whatever project is necessary. So the project that I'm going to present is just on that combined flood and water supply FERO operation. On the Yuba River, what we're looking at is this is the southwest corner of the Goldfields. This is the upstream end of the Yuba River levee. Here's the 200-year Goldfields levee. The only thing we need to do on the Yuba River is raise that western edge of the Goldfields cobble embankment. It's a relatively modest embankment, much like we did with our 100-year project. What that does is that prevents this embankment from overtopping. In existing conditions, this embankment overtops in the 500-year event. We want to push that water back into the Yuba River. And what it does is it significantly reduces flood stages along the rest of the Yuba River levee to the point that no investments required, that levee would get to 500-year with this embankment raising and the Arc Spillway. We don't need to take any action on the Feather River or the Bear River below Highway 70. We're looking north is to the right on this graphic. Here's the Feather River. This is the Bear. This is the Western Pacific Interceptor Canal. And so the only improvements that are required are some levee raising and some fill on the Upper Bear, and then raising of the Western Pacific Interceptor Canal levee. Pretty modest project features. So I've talked about the Arc Spillway and the FERO operations. The cost of those actions is $18.6 million. So if the Arc Spillway is built, if a flood water supply FERO operation is built or adopted for $18.6 million, we can get this system to 500 a year. What it doesn't include is the WPIC levy extension, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. That's about $34 to $40 million of additional expense. And if the FERO operation is the higher water surface that doesn't include the flood piece for Oroville, there'd be another 20 to 30 million in investment needed in the Feather River and the Bear River below Highway 70. So worst case, if a not as favorable FERO operation is adopted, it double the project cost to about 40 million. So let's talk about the WPIC levy extension. This is the Olive Hearst Detention Basin. This is Highway 70. So north is to the right. McGowan is just off the screen to the right. Under existing conditions in large flood events, well, even the 100 and 200 year event, we're relying on Highway 70 for flood protection. The Western Pacific Interceptor Canal and the Olive Hearst Detention Basin Ring Levy tie into Highway 70. And so for 100 year and 200 year, we're certifying that Highway 70 is functioning as a flood control structure. In the 500 year, Highway 70 starts to overtop. And then you get flooding as you've historically had in the Madge Avenue, Rose Avenue areas. And we looked at how we could prevent relying on Highway 70 for flood protection and stop that flooding in those the Rose and Madge Avenue area. But the cost of that feature at 30 to 40 million greatly exceeds the benefits. There's also significant environmental impacts associated with this. And so we did not carry this forward in the design. And that alternative was also part of the preferred alternative that was recommended in the EIR. And Ann will talk about this a little more, but it is not what we're recommending the board adopt today. And so let me pause there and see if there's any questions on what I've presented. Then I'm going to turn it over to Ann King, who's going to talk about the CEQA portion of this presentation.
Thanks, Rick. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Rick said, I'm going to focus now some time on the CEQA aspects of which are the primary feature of the resolutions you're considering. And this first slide just summarizes that. I'll address each of these in a little bit more detail. But as Rick said, to approve and certify the EIR, that's the first resolution. The second includes the other four bullets. So approving alternative 1 as the project for implementation, as Rick just described, that is the project without the WPIC West Levy extension. Adopting the mitigation monitoring and reporting program, adopting the findings and statement of overriding considerations, and directing staff to file the notice of determination, indicating that those steps have been taken. So project alternative 1, this was one of the formally identified alternatives in the draft EIR. It was evaluated in detail in the document, and it includes all of the components of the proposed project that was described without that WPIC West Levy extension. As Rick already described, it provides 500-year protection to the vast majority of the system with just that exception that he was talking about at Highway 70 and for that southern portion of Olive Hearst. And it is the environmentally superior alternative. So it eliminates significant impacts on several resource areas, notably aesthetic resources. You know, there are a number of residents there along that south edge of Olive Hearst that would have had a new levee embankment, built just south of their residences that would have a substantial effect on their view shed. It also eliminates significant impacts associated with the loss of agricultural land in that footprint, including orchards and rice land in that area. And Rick alluded to also eliminating some of the significant biological resource impacts. There are some seasonal wetland areas in that footprint and associated species that could be substantially affected. And then in addition, it reduces impacts to many of the other resource areas for obvious reasons, because it eliminates constructing 2 miles of additional levee embankment. So the air quality emissions, traffic effects on other biological resources, and various other things that would not occur without that piece. So we did receive 3 comment letters on the draft EIR. Those are listed here. They were from private entities in the Horseshoe, landowners in the Horseshoe Basin area, and also Western Aggregates and their legal representatives. We did not receive any formal comments from any state agencies or federal agencies for that matter, local agencies either. So these are the only 3 comment letters that were received. And the primary issues they raised were concerns about potential to worsen flooding and adversely affect agriculture in the Horseshoe Basin area. And then on the part of Western Aggregates, the availability and transport of materials, mining resources in the Goldfields area. So the final EIR includes those comment letters in whole. And also I'll note that one of the comment letters incorporated by reference comment letters that were submitted on NOP. And the EIR responds to each of those individual comments and provides a response for all of them. Just to summarize some of the key topics that are covered in the responses. They answer questions about the hydraulic impact analysis, the approach, the methodology that was taken, and highlights the fact that it followed Army Corps of Engineers and Central Valley Flood Protection Board requirements. The responses also reiterate a number of the conclusions and the evidence that's provided in the draft EIR related to the hydraulic impact analysis. So for example, that the water surface elevation in the WPIC would be less than ½ an inch at the maximum. So the most that the project could increase that water surface elevation in the WPIC, which is of the greatest concern to the Horseshoe landowners, would be by less than ½ an inch. And under certain conditions and at certain locations that were analyzed, it would be less than that. And also to highlight that past TRLIA projects have substantially reduced the water surface elevation in the WPIC, most notably and primarily because of constructing the Bear River setback levee. So conditions are better now than they were before TRLIA projects began being implemented. The responses also indicate why the horseshoe levees are not part of the proposed project and why it wouldn't be appropriate to include them. And finally, they assure Western Aggregates that TRLIA is aware of their access rights along the Yuba River South Levee and the western edge of the Goldfields, certainly aware of those. And if the project moves forward in design and implementation, as with past projects, TRLIA would work with Western Aggregates to address those concerns. That is the whole of the final EIR, the substance of it. No changes were necessary to the draft EIR. There were no issues raised or situations that arose that require under CEQA to make changes or modifications to the draft EIR. So the mitigation monitoring and reporting program includes a number of mitigation measures that are incorporated into the project and the MMRP to reduce potentially significant and significant impacts to less than significant levels. And that's the case for all of these resources that are listed here in these sub-bullets. There is only one exception. There would be some noise impacts associated with potential work along the Yuba River South Levee, where there are a number of residences immediately adjacent to the landside toe of that levee. And despite the fact that the mitigation measures include things that would reduce the noise levels, it would not necessarily be possible to reduce them to below the relevant thresholds. But that would be a very localized and temporary impact, but could remain significant and unavoidable. And that gets me to my final slide here, highlighting the statement of overriding considerations. So because the project may have significant and unavoidable impacts related to that increase in ambient noise level, that is acknowledged in the statement of overriding considerations. Mitigation measures would be incorporated, as I said before, to avoid, minimize, and compensate for the impacts. Also, it's highlighted that the project would reduce flood risk to the RD 784 service area. And that obviously is a key benefit. So the conclusion being that that specific overriding benefit of the project outweighs the potential significant and unavoidable impact of those temporary localized noise increases. So with that, I also would be happy to take any questions from the board or the public if we have any public participating. Okay.
Yes, I just encourage though, if there's any public that want to make a comment, this would be their opportunity while the public hearing is open.
Motion carries. Next, we have board and staff reports. Kevin?
All right, so I know that was a quick motion and carried through, but that was very significant, as Rick had mentioned. Yep, so only $18 million, Rick? I just want to make sure we got that on the record. Right, that's where this whole thing began, almost 20 years ago. All right, I don't have anything specific, but Kyle, is there anything you'd like to report out on?
Fiscal year ending June 30, 2021.
Anything on that? Okay, we will have a budget for you for the 22-23 fiscal year. We're pulling together. As the board may recall, when Paul Bruner was still here, when you adopted the current fiscal year budget, he also projected, for the 22-23 fiscal year. So we're evaluating that, and we'll bring that back before you for action.
Perfect, thank you. Is there anything else? At this time, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.